All right, so we're back with next day tip number 5, and we're going to continue our thoughts on how to make progress during this intermediate stage of your training life cycle. So, topic today is what we're going to call accidental compensation. Now, what the hell is that? Well, you're going to find out in the next couple of minutes, but really what it is when you're training and trying to make progress in your training, sometimes it's easy to slip into certain habits that are actually going to sabotage your progress. And I'm going to give some examples as we go through here. But the first thing and I mentioned it very quickly then, was that we want to think about this as a training principle or a thing that's happening in training. We'll talk about the testing another time. But when we're training, the idea is to be building yourself up. The training is going to hopefully lead to some kind of results and some kind of adaptation in your body. So the training needs to challenge your current abilities, and then it's going to cause some kind of overload stimulus, and then your body will adapt and improve. And so really what this topic is today is making sure that we're getting the right sort of challenge and we are encouraging the right sort of adaptations from that overload. So let's get into it. So the first thing to think about here is when we're training certain movements. Now this might seem pretty obvious, but let's say that we're trying to improve your front squat. So you've got a training, it's going to be 3 weeks, and there should be some kind of progression in that 3 weeks. Now, first week you do front squat, it feels good. Second week you do a little bit harder, you're overloading. And then the third week you decide, well, the front squat's not going much harder, it's hard to improve, so I'm going to do back squat. And then you've just sort of compensated, and yeah, you're still squatting, but you've just avoided the whole point, which was a front squat progression. Now that seems like a little bit crazy example, but what about pull-ups and chin-ups, for example? We're doing a few weeks of pull-ups, and then, hey, that's getting too tough, we're going to switch to chin-ups. And see that it kind of avoids the whole thing that you're trying to approach, which was that pull-up. Now, I understand that you can improve one by training something else, but let's not lose focus with that right now. The next is another super common one, is the range of motion. So again, let's take the squat, and week 1, full squats, ass to grass, week 2, ass to grass, and then you're feeling you've got a bit more weight on the bar, and all of a sudden you're doing half squats. Now, again, you can make progress doing things like that, but you're really avoiding the challenge and you're avoiding overloading that particular style of squat that you want to work on. And so the point being here is not that half squats are bad, or not that full squats are all you must do. It must be that you understand that if you're doing a training progression, you need to control the variables and then overload with that control. And that's how you're going to see if you're actually going to improve week to week. Now, what that might mean is, it might mean that that last part of the training is very hard, and the last part of the progression. But that's exactly it. That's the challenge, that's the overload, and then you recover and you improve. So let's keep going. Technique and movement quality here. So you can imagine, if we're talking deadlifts now, that keeping the straight back is going to be something that's usually very important, but you can possibly lift more weight by rounding your back. But then it's like the risk goes up. So if you're doing a training cycle with a straight back, then you've got to maintain that, and you're going to challenge yourself with that specific technique. So it comes in a little bit, range of motion is another technique thing there, but you must maintain it, whether it's whatever movement you're training. Movement quality as well, so it falls into the same category there of technique, but if you're maintaining a certain quality, you're trying to progress with that same sort of quality. Now, there's always a little gray area. It's not, black or white, good or bad, but it must be within sort of an acceptable level that you're trying to be consistent with. Now, equipment. Now, this is a big one, because again, let's talk deadlifts. So if we're doing a deadlift progression, the first 2 weeks you build up, and then week 3 you're like, hey, I'm going to use a belt. Now it's a totally different thing. It's a deadlift with a belt versus not a belt. So are you actually progressing during that training cycle, or are you doing a totally different movement? Because I would say that deadlift with a belt or without a belt, there are 2 different training, even though it's still a deadlift. And some people say, well, it's still a deadlift, but then if the belt doesn't make a difference, then why are you wearing it? And again, it's not about the belt being good or bad, it's just about understanding whether you are progressing in your training. And if you start changing things like this, it's very hard to see, are you actually progressing, or are you just modifying what you're doing and finding variation that feels like progression? Because it can be very different. Other things, yeah, the classic knee sleeves, wrist wraps, belts, pre-workouts, if that's equipment or supplements, but stuff like that. It's all changing up, and it kind of makes it cloudy to see whether you are progressing. Splits. Now, this is more if we're talking conditioning workouts or some kind of volume building. So let's take push-ups, for example. Write this one down. We're going to do 10 minutes, 10 per minute. All right, so that's that. And you're going to do, are we doing it unbroken? Or are we doing 5 plus 5? Or are we doing 10 singles per minute? Because it makes a huge difference. And then if we want to progress that, let's say we did it unbroken. Now the next week, if we're going to do 12 per minute, and I do 6 plus 6, is that progression? Maybe it is. You have to understand what the goal is. Is the goal simply to do more, or is the goal of the training to do unbroken sets? So you need to understand that and make that clear, and then figure out how you're going to challenge and overload. And that's where coaching can help there, but if it is supposed to be unbroken, then if you're doing 6 plus 6, you've actually just missed the point entirely. Weaknesses now. So this is where we really get some compensation now, that maybe it's a certain part of the movement. Let's take a pull-up, that top third, getting the chin over the bar. Maybe that's a challenge and the really difficult part. So sometimes it's easy just to avoid that and be like, hey, I'm going to pull to here, and then you're not actually progressing with your full movement. And you might seem like, hey, that's range of motion, but there can be tons of other examples. For example, in the deep squat, like getting that bottom position, and the quality suffers, so then just avoiding it, because you're trying to stack on more weight. So you're like, maybe you're thinking in your head that, hey, I'm going to make progress by putting more weight on the bar, where instead the progress in that example would have been maintain the full range of motion, the full technique, and work on the weakness, which is that bottom part of the squat in this example. And then that's going to be your progression, not just the weight on the bar, but actually improving that part of the squat. And later on, you can work on those heavier squats once you've built that. And that ties into yesterday's tip about not getting stuck or feeling negative about certain things that are hard. Because if you build those weaknesses, it's going to allow you to progress overall, which is what the whole point is. And then another one, a similar thing, is injury. Now, injury, of course, if you've broken your arm, then that's like, hey, totally different thing. But we're more talking like if you're coming back from an injury, or if it's a very minor situation, and just avoiding that because you're chasing bigger weights or going faster is not a way to progress. Instead, you can realize, hey, this is something that's holding me back. This certain movement or issue that I have is causing pain or problems. So maybe taking a couple of steps back, maintaining that, and overloading safely through that injury is going to be a way to progress overall. So we don't need to go into specifics there, but maybe that kind of limitation is actually telling you something, that here is something I need to really work on, and it's not just about that big weights going fast. It's more like, hey, let's get all of these things organized, and then the injury goes away, and then all of a sudden you're just much healthier and fitter overall. So this is a huge topic, and one that is just encompasses so much, but it's very, very important to understand that the whole point of training is to challenge and overload, and these kind of issues that we covered here are often like going around that challenge. So we just want to make sure that we're not doing that accidentally, and tomorrow's tip is more going to be like, how can we work on these things and actually do some of them on purpose, which is a totally different thing. So today was more about, hey, if I'm doing these accidentally, tomorrow's next tip is going to be more about hey, I want to actually modify some of these on purpose to create even bigger challenge. Thanks.